Infinite Dendrogram is a VR MMO fantasy adventure light novel written by Sakon Kaido. This is my optimistic and spoiler-free review of Volume 1 as translated by J Novel Club. In the year 2043, Infinite Dendrogram is the world's first successful full-dive VR MMO. The prologue chapter just completely takes a jab at all other VR MMO stories, namely Sword Art Online, but also uses all the same terminology as those stories. If you are familiar with any other VR MMO story, then it's all the same here. Infinite Dendrogram doesn't waste too much time in real life and gets straight into the game. The major points being for this game that it has infinite possibilities with an embryo ability where every single player gets an evolving, unique skill. The main character, Reiji, is your pretty standard guy. There isn't overly strange or weird about him, and he even delays jumping into the game for the sake of his studies, more restrained than me, that's for sure. You get introduced and spend a bunch of time with Reiji's brother Shu, who is slightly strange, but nothing that gets annoying and gives you a good chuckle. Shu, being a veteran of the game, shows his brother the ropes, honestly more so for the reader, but it's not all a smooth tutorial and keeps things interesting. The start of this book is somewhat slow even after getting in the game pretty fast. Even though Reiji is familiar with a game of this nature, a lot of the time is spent speaking about the system and small nuances which for me is slightly tedious, but I can appreciate the details. In the scheme of the game with having infinite possibilities, it still takes most of the normal fancy RPG tropes with levels, stats and fighting with all familiar human weaponry. The monsters that you come across don't appear as anything that's out there, so I'd like to see some more variety and wildness in those ideas. Easily the biggest downfall of this book is just the reason which drives Reiji forward, excluding the fact it's a game and he wants to have fun. When I got to the end of this volume, despite very much enjoying the majority of the book, I was left with this feeling of where should I be expecting things to lead to? The reasons for Reiji pushing onwards are super lame and super boring. By the end of the initial volume, I'd expect a lot more involved endgame goal. Beyond this, the only other thing that really stuck out badly for me was the character that Reiji parties up with. They have a very peculiar character job, and even with a few chuckles that can bring it up now and then, it feels as though it's just done to fill the mature/ecchi quota. It's not pushed too hard though, so I can't complain too much. You're introduced to a varied number of other famous characters in the game which give you a sense of power level in the game, and it seems fairly reasonable. I don't get the feeling that the game is going to get into astronomical power levels and always be more of a strategic style of battle rather than just big numbers. I'm also somewhat glad that Reiji doesn't seem to stand out too much from what is expected of a newbie, aside from the fact he has a slightly rarer embryo type which allows it to have a personality, which going forward she is a main character. I don't think she can even be separated from him. This pairing is pretty alright. They have a few bits of banter going back and forward and overall has plenty to grow. They do share that same weak goal I talked about earlier, which hopefully will evolve into something more interesting. If I had to pick my favourite chemistry out of all the characters in this book though, I'd still have to go with Reiji and his brother. Despite the fairly normalness of Reiji's character, you will still get a few of those main character specific plot devices which will pop up to help him out. They aren't completely smoothed in with the story, so they're very obvious when they happen. Although it is nice that a few of these events do have real reasonable repercussions, so it's not just some convenience for the main character. The details of the fights in this book are reasonable enough. They aren't anywhere near as detailed as other books, which give you very specific body part movement details, but on the other hand you are getting more higher level strategy details. I personally am more of a fan of martial arts close quarter details in fights, but considering in this game there isn't been any mention at all of body part damage, I can imagine a lot of details will be meaningless for most encounters. You're somewhat also given a fair amount of information and time into high level politics between the different kingdoms or factions in this world. Given the description of these factions, both myself and Reiji almost wished they chose a different starting faction, as the one ultimately chosen was easily the most boring and could have easily turned out a much more wild and vastly interesting setting. I hope that in the future there is a lot more travelling to all these other places, because the initial setting is a very standard fantasy setting and it isn't really that adventurous at all on part of the author. Overall, Infinite Dendrogram is a very solid fantasy adventure light novel. The character interactions and personalities are varied enough and not too quirky. The setting which the main characters are in could be a bit more interesting, but the surrounding world if they get to it could prove to have a lot more. There is a lot of time spent talking about game mechanics, and in this first volume there is barely any time jumps. You don't feel like you're missing out on any details. The fact it's a game doesn't leave in real life completely out of the picture. Several times it takes this into account, but it's a few paragraphs at most, so it doesn't pull you out of what you truly want to be reading. I'll definitely look forward to future volumes and hope Reiji along with his embryo find a much stronger goal to strive towards. Thanks for listening, until next time.